Most people grow up with a very simple idea about progress. If something isn't moving, you apply more effort. If results don't appear, you work harder. If motivation drops, you discipline yourself back into action. This idea is rarely questioned because it feels obvious. It is reinforced by school, work, and culture. Effort is praised. Persistence is admired. Struggle is treated as proof of commitment, and often this logic works, at least at first. But there is a quiet moment many people eventually encounter where this approach begins to fail. Not dramatically, not all at once. Gradually, they notice that increasing effort no longer produces movement, that pushing harder doesn't create clarity but tension, that discipline doesn't feel stabilizing but heavy. Instead of momentum, there is friction. This experience is deeply confusing because it contradicts everything they've been told. If effort is good, why does it suddenly feel bad? If discipline is strength, why does it lead to exhaustion instead of progress? These questions rarely get answered. They get overridden. People assume the problem is still them, that they aren't trying hard enough yet, that they need more structure, more resolve, more pressure. But what's actually happening here is more subtle and more human. When this friction first appears, most people don't recognize it as resistance. They just feel uncomfortable. There is a slight tightening when they think about doing something they should do, a heaviness before starting tasks that used to feel neutral, a sense of effort appearing before the action has even begun. This feeling is often labeled as a lack of motivation, but motivation hasn't disappeared. It's been overshadowed by something else, pressure. Pressure doesn't always feel intense or dramatic. Often it's quiet, persistent, barely noticeable until it accumulates. It shows up as expectation hovering in the background, as the sense that something needs to happen, now, soon, or eventually, as the feeling of being measured even when no one else is watching. Over time, this pressure changes how effort feels. Effort stops feeling like choice and starts feeling like obligation. And once effort becomes an obligation, the system begins to respond differently. Most people don't notice the moment when effort begins to feel heavy. There isn't a clear before and after point. There's no dramatic collapse. Instead, it starts quietly. A task that once felt straightforward begins to carry a faint sense of reluctance. Not dread, just a subtle resistance. A pause before starting. A moment of hesitation that didn't used to be there. Because the resistance is mild, it's easy to dismiss. People assume they're tired, distracted, out of practice. They don't see it as a signal. They see it as a personal shortcoming, and so they respond in the only way they've been taught, by pushing. This is how pressure enters unnoticed. Pressure doesn't arrive as panic. It arrives as expectation. An internal sense that you should be able to do this by now, that if you just applied yourself properly, the resistance would disappear. That expectation doesn't feel hostile, it feels reasonable. But it changes the emotional context of effort. Effort stops being exploratory. It becomes evaluative, and once effort becomes evaluative, the body starts paying attention. To understand why effort can begin to feel heavy, it helps to look beneath behavior itself. Effort is usually discussed as something mechanical, something you either apply or don't. But effort is never just an action. It always carries meaning. Every time you make an effort, your system is also asking a quieter question. Why am I doing this? What happens if I don't? When effort is chosen freely, the answers to those questions feel neutral or even positive. There is room to stop, room to adjust, room to change direction without consequence. But when effort starts to feel compulsory, those questions take on a different tone. Effort becomes tied to approval, to worth, to relief from guilt or anxiety, and in that context, effort stops being supportive. It becomes conditional. The same action, performed under these conditions, no longer feels like movement forward. It feels like compliance. Compliance creates a very specific internal state. It narrows attention. It heightens self-monitoring. It introduces a sense of being watched. Even when the watcher is internal, this internal monitoring doesn't need to be harsh to be effective. A quiet sense of evaluation is enough. Am I doing enough? Should I be doing more? Why am I not further along? These questions don't motivate. They activate vigilance. Vigilance is not panic. It's readiness for threat. The system preparing itself to avoid consequence, and vigilance, maintained over time, is exhausting. There is a critical shift that happens when effort no longer feels optional. When effort feels optional, there is room to pause, room to fail, room to change direction. But when effort feels mandatory, that room disappears. The internal message changes from "I'm choosing to do this" to "I have to do this or something is wrong." That subtle change transforms effort from support into demand. The nervous system does not respond to logic. It responds to conditions. It registers tone, context, implied consequence. When effort is paired with internal pressure, the system doesn't experience effort as neutral. It experiences it as threat adjacent, not danger, but vigilance. And vigilance narrows capacity. This is why people feel confused by their own reactions. They want progress. They agree with their goals. They understand what needs to happen. And yet, something inside pulls back. That pullback isn't defiance, it's protection. This exhaustion is often misunderstood because it doesn't always look like stress. Sometimes it looks like disengagement, sometimes like procrastination, sometimes like numbness. People say they feel tired all the time, even when they haven't done much. They feel overwhelmed before starting. They feel resistance without knowing what they're resisting. What they're responding to is not the task itself, it's the pressure attached to it. Pressure accumulates quietly. Each expectation adds weight. Each unresolved intention lingers in the background. Eventually, even simple actions begin to feel costly. At this point, many people turn toward discipline as a solution. They decide that feelings can't be trusted, that hesitation must be overridden. That structure will restore control. Discipline offers something appealing: certainty. Rules feel stabilizing when everything else feels vague, and for a while discipline can produce movement. There is a sense of regaining authority, of pushing back against resistance, but discipline applied without sensitivity creates a new problem. It introduces an internal authority that never rests, an internal voice that is always watching, always evaluating, always waiting for a lapse. That voice doesn't shout, it doesn't need to. Its constancy is enough. When effort stops working, many people install discipline as an internal authority. Discipline becomes the voice that says, "Feelings don't matter, just do it." Stop hesitating. At first, this voice feels stabilizing, firm, clear, but over time it becomes constant. An internal authority doesn't sleep. It observes, evaluates, keeps score. Even moments of rest are monitored. This creates a state of continuous self-surveillance, and continuous surveillance is exhausting. Discipline backfires not because it's wrong, but because it removes permission. Permission to stop. Permission to recalibrate. Permission to listen. Without permission, effort becomes extraction, and extraction depletes. There is a difference between cooperation and compliance. Compliance produces movement, but at a cost. Cooperation produces movement with sustainability. When discipline forces compliance, resistance grows quietly underneath. Living under constant internal evaluation changes how effort is experienced. Effort becomes performative, something done to satisfy the watcher rather than serve the self, and over time that creates strain. Strain doesn't always feel dramatic. Often it feels dull, draining, like carrying weight that never gets put down. This is where avoidance begins to make sense. Avoidance isn't a desire to do nothing, it's a desire to reduce pressure. When effort feels like scrutiny, avoidance feels like relief. Avoidance reduces demand. It removes evaluation. It softens pressure. It gives the system a break from being watched, that relief is real, which is why avoidance persists. Avoidance is often treated as a problem to eliminate, but elimination misses the point. Avoidance isn't the cause, it's the response, a response to sustained internal pressure. Shame reintroduces threat. It tells the system that avoidance itself is dangerous. This forces avoidance to become covert, and covert resistance is harder to resolve. That relief is real, and because it's real, avoidance gets reinforced. Avoiding a task reduces pressure immediately. The body relaxes, the mind quiets, but avoidance also creates distance from things that matter. Goals drift. Intentions fade. That distance eventually produces guilt. Guilt reintroduces pressure. Pressure brings effort back into focus. Effort triggers resistance again, and the cycle repeats. From the outside, it looks like inconsistency. From the inside, it feels like being trapped. This cycle persists because it's rarely recognized for what it is. People interpret it as a personal flaw rather than a systemic response. They assume something is wrong with them, that they lack discipline, that they need to try harder still. But trying harder within this system only increases pressure, and increased pressure deepens resistance. The problem isn't a lack of effort, it's the conditions under which effort is being applied. A crucial concept here is capacity. Capacity is not motivation. It's not willpower. It's the internal space that allows effort to be absorbed without strain. When capacity is high, effort feels light. When capacity is low, the same effort feels overwhelming. Capacity is influenced by safety, rest, trust, and permission, not by pressure. But capacity is rarely discussed. It's treated as irrelevant. People are told to push regardless of how they feel, to ignore internal signals, to override resistance. But resistance often is the signal. Once this loop is established, people don't experience it as a clear cycle. They experience it as a way of being. Effort feels heavy, but that heaviness becomes familiar. Avoidance brings relief, but that relief feels temporary and slightly uncomfortable. Guilt fills the space in between, quietly pushing everything forward again. Over time, this pattern stops standing out. It becomes background noise. People stop asking why effort feels difficult. They assume it's normal. They assume adulthood simply feels this way. This is one of the reasons the pattern persists for so long. It doesn't announce itself as a problem. It presents itself as reality. Inside this loop, willingness slowly erodes. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Small acts of effort begin to require preparation. Mental bracing, internal negotiation, even things a person wants to do start to feel oddly distant. This is not because desire has vanished. It's because desire has become associated with pressure. When desire leads directly to expectation, it stops feeling open. It stops feeling inviting, and without invitation, movement becomes harder to initiate. As the loop continues, urgency often increases. People feel behind, late, out of sync with where they think they should be. Urgency adds pressure. Pressure adds resistance. This creates the strange experience of feeling rushed while also feeling stuck. The mind speeds up. The body slows down, and that mismatch is deeply uncomfortable. One of the less obvious effects of this pattern is the loss of internal trust. People stop trusting their own signals. Fatigue feels suspicious. Hesitation feels dangerous. Instead of listening inwardly, they monitor themselves. Every feeling becomes something to interpret, manage, or override. This constant self-monitoring fragments attention and drains energy. Progress becomes something to control rather than something to participate in. Over time, effort stops being about actions and starts being about identity. People begin to define themselves by how hard they push, by how much they endure, by how little rest they allow. This makes pressure feel necessary. Letting go of pressure can feel like letting go of self-respect. But identities built on pressure are fragile. They require constant maintenance, and maintenance is exhausting. Within this system, pauses feel risky. A pause feels like momentum loss, like regression, like failure. Even brief moments of stillness can trigger anxiety, not because stillness is harmful, but because stillness removes distraction. It reveals how tired the system actually is, and that recognition can feel overwhelming. At this stage, effort can paradoxically become a form of avoidance. Staying busy avoids confronting fatigue. Staying disciplined avoids uncertainty. Staying driven avoids stillness. Effort keeps things moving just enough to prevent collapse, but it also prevents recovery. This is why people can appear functional while feeling deeply worn down. Seeing this pattern clearly doesn't immediately dissolve it, but it changes the emotional tone around it. The struggle becomes understandable instead of shameful, predictable instead of personal, and that shift matters, because systems soften when they are understood, and understanding creates the conditions where pressure no longer needs to do all the work. This loop doesn't resolve itself quickly, because effort temporarily works, because discipline temporarily stabilizes things. Those temporary gains mask the underlying cost. Without a clear explanation, people personalize the problem. They assume they lack discipline, consistency, strength, but the pattern is structural, not personal. Repeated attempts followed by collapse create anticipation of failure. That anticipation increases pressure, which accelerates resistance. When resistance is ignored repeatedly, it doesn't disappear. It adapts. It becomes more diffuse, more tiring, harder to name. People begin to feel foggy, unfocused, detached from goals they once cared about. They assume they've lost motivation. But what they've lost is capacity. Capacity doesn't collapse suddenly. It erodes under sustained self-coercion. This erosion is why rest often feels uncomfortable in these situations. Rest removes structure, it removes justification, and when effort has been tied to worth, rest feels undeserved. People feel guilty for slowing down. Rest feels like falling behind, but rest is not the absence of effort. It's the restoration of capacity. Without restored capacity, effort will always feel heavy, no matter how disciplined it looks. Rest removes structure. And when structure has been holding everything together, its absence feels dangerous. This is why rest often feels wrong even when it's needed. Rest restores capacity, not instantly, not dramatically, but enough to change how effort feels. None of this means that effort is wrong or unnecessary. It means effort needs the right context. Effort applied within safety feels different from effort applied under threat. The action may be identical. The internal experience is not, and behavior follows experience. When effort feels safe, movement happens more naturally. When effort feels threatening, resistance is inevitable. This is why understanding alone rarely produces change. Understanding can clarify, but it doesn't automatically remove pressure. In some cases, it adds to it. Each insight becomes another expectation, another thing to live up to, another standard to meet. Over time, even clarity becomes heavy, And when clarity becomes heavy, it too is resisted. What begins to shift things is not a new strategy, but a change in relationship, a different way of relating to effort, a different interpretation of resistance. When resistance stops being treated as an enemy, it starts revealing its purpose. It shows where pressure has accumulated, where capacity has been exceeded, where effort has lost its sense of choice. This recognition doesn't produce an immediate solution. It produces relief, relief from self-blame, relief from urgency, relief from the idea that you're broken, and relief matters because it restores capacity, quietly, gradually. With restored capacity, effort begins to change character. It becomes less about forcing movement and more about allowing it, less about compliance and more about cooperation. The same actions feel different because they are no longer imposed under threat. They are chosen within safety. This is often where progress resumes. Not dramatically, not linearly, not because someone finally tried hard enough, but because effort stopped being used as a weapon against themselves. Resistance softens when it no longer needs to protect. There is no final state where effort never feels heavy again. There is no permanent resolution. There is only increasing sensitivity to the conditions under which effort helps versus harms. That sensitivity is not weakness, it's intelligence. Once this pattern is seen clearly, it can't be unseen, not because it demands change, but because it removes confusion. Force reinforces the same conditions that created resistance. Relief changes them. This isn't a solution. It's an explanation. And explanations reduce pressure by replacing blame with understanding. Trying harder fails not because effort is useless, but because effort without safety becomes pressure, and pressure invites resistance. When that relationship is seen clearly, the struggle around progress changes shape. It becomes less personal, less moral, less urgent. Nothing needs to be forced right now. Nothing needs to be proven. Understanding does not fix everything, but it removes the weight of believing you are the problem. And sometimes that quiet shift is enough to let movement begin again, not through force, but through relief.